After 12 years of running my father's company, I had finally turned it into a $75 million business. During a family dinner, my dad looked at me, smiled, and said, "Your brother will take over now." My heart sank, but I forced a smile. The next morning, everything changed. I still remember my father's smile that night, his hand resting on my brother's shoulder, as though he had already decided long before he spoke the words that would alter everything. "Your brother will take over now." I felt my stomach drop, but years of practice kept my face calm. I smiled back, pretending his words didn't wound me deeply, as if they weren't undoing everything I had worked for over the past 12 years. The dining room was filled with the clinking of glasses, soft conversations between relatives and business associates. This wasn't just a family meal, it was a celebration, meant to honor all we had achieved, everything I had achieved. My father had founded Harper & Company when I was a child, a small logistics firm struggling to survive in its early days. I watched him fight to keep it afloat, working long hours, sacrificing family trips, always searching for the next contract to keep the business going. When I was 24, fresh out of business school, he finally allowed me to step in, though I had to earn that chance. And I didn't just step in, I transformed Harper & Company from a struggling regional operation into a national leader, expanding its reach, securing million-dollar deals, and implementing cutting-edge technology. What was once a nearly bankrupt company was now worth $75 million. But in that moment, none of that mattered. My father had already chosen my brother Ethan to take over, not me. A ripple of approval spread across the table, murmurs of congratulations for Ethan. I watched him lower his gaze, pretending to be humble, though I knew better. Ethan had never truly cared about the business. Over the last 10 years, he had jumped from one failed venture to the next, never quite finding his place. He wasn't passionate about logistics, nor operations, but he wanted power. I had spent 12 years proving myself, building Harper & Company from the ground up, making every difficult decision, staying late to strategize, and negotiating every contract. Ethan had done none of that, yet here we were, still. I suppressed my emotions. I had learned long ago that in this family, showing any vulnerability was a sign of weakness. I reached for my wine glass, steadying my hand before lifting it. "Smile, Lisa, smile," I told myself, my voice controlled. The guests raised their glasses, unaware of the storm brewing inside me. My mother glanced at me from across the table, her expression unreadable, but I knew she understood. Unlike my father, she had always seen my efforts, but she would never interfere. She never did. And then there was my father, grinning with that same unwavering certainty, completely oblivious to the fact that his choice had set something in motion. Ethan met my gaze across the table, his lips curling into a barely concealed smirk. That was when I knew this wasn't just my father's decision. Ethan had been waiting for this moment. He had carefully positioned himself, playing the role of the son who had finally found his path. And my father, ever the traditionalist, saw no flaw in his logic. A son was meant to inherit the empire, while a daughter's contributions were always temporary, no matter how hard she fought to prove otherwise. But what they didn't realize, what neither of them had accounted for, was that I had spent 12 years not just building a company, but securing my position within it. And tomorrow, they would see exactly what that meant. That night, I barely slept. My mind replayed every sacrifice I had made for Harper & Company, the long hours, missed birthdays, relationships that crumbled under my ambition. I had given everything to this company, and now they expected me to step aside. They had underestimated me. By 3 a.m., I was in my home office, my fingers flying across the keyboard. Every contract, every share, every executive agreement. I knew the company's inner workings better than anyone. Ethan thought the transition would be easy, that by next week, his name would be on the office door, his position secured. What he didn't know was that while my father had been busy with public events, and my brother had been pretending to learn the business, I had been securing something far more valuable: control. At exactly 8:45 a.m., I walked into Harper & Company headquarters, just as I had for the past 12 years, the same walls, the same polished floors, the same buzz of activity as employees settled into their routines. But today was different. Today, I wasn't just heading to my office, I was walking into a battleground. The reception area was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. They knew. The news of my father's announcement had spread like wildfire. Employees glanced at me nervously, unsure of where their loyalties should lie. I didn't acknowledge them. I walked with confidence, my heels clicking sharply on the marble floors, my posture strong. Never let them see you falter. I walked into my office and closed the door behind me. I had exactly 15 minutes before my father and Ethan arrived. Believing they were about to step into their new roles as CEO and heir apparent, 15 minutes before their entire plan would fall apart. I sat down at my desk, took a deep breath, and powered up my computer. The screen flickered to life, displaying a series of confidential documents and contracts, ones they had never bothered to look at, assuming they weren't important. I pulled up my ownership records. My fingers hovered for a moment over the keyboard before I clicked on the file titled Executive Shareholders Agreement and waited. At exactly 9 a.m., there was a firm knock on my door. I didn't respond. The door swung open, and in walked my father and Ethan, both radiating confidence, my father's natural, Ethan's carefully cultivated. My father walked in like a monarch surveying his domain, while Ethan, in an expensive navy suit, flashed me a smug, victorious grin. I nearly laughed out loud. "Lisa," my father said, his tone authoritative, as if he were doing me a favor by acknowledging my presence. "I trust you're aware of the transition happening today?" "Transition?" I repeated, keeping my tone even, leaning back in my chair. I glanced at Ethan, whose smirk only grew wider. "Good," my father continued, nodding as if we were all on the same page. "Ethan will be stepping in as the new CEO. We'll need you to assist with the transition. Help him get up to speed before you officially move on." I raised an eyebrow. "Move on?" I repeated, feigning confusion. "Dad, I think you've got something wrong here." His face twitched in annoyance. He was used to me silently falling in line, not challenging him. This wasn't what he expected. "Lisa," he said, his voice tight, like he was speaking to a child, "this isn't up for discussion. We've made the decision." I smiled slowly, a knowing smile. "Oh, I know, Dad," I replied softly. "The thing is, you don't actually have the authority to make that decision." Ethan let out a low scoff, shaking his head. "Lisa, don't make this harder than it needs to be. We're trying to handle this the easy way." I didn't respond. Instead, I reached for the remote and pressed a button. The large screen on my office wall lit up, displaying the document I had been reviewing earlier, Executive Shareholders Agreement, signed on August 17, 2015. The signatories, Lisa Harper, James Harper, father, Ethan Harper. My father's face paled slightly. I turned to Ethan. "Do you even know what this document is?" He crossed his arms, discomfort growing on his face. "A shareholders agreement," he guessed. I nodded. "Yes, and do you know what it says?" I tapped the screen, highlighting a key clause. This agreement was made during the company's restructuring. It clearly states that any change in executive leadership, like appointing a new CEO, requires approval from all majority shareholders. I looked my father squarely in the eye. "Dad, I own 60% of the company's shares." The silence in the room was suffocating. My father's face hardened. "That can't be right," Ethan muttered, stepping forward to inspect the document. "Actually, it's very much right," I said calmly. "While you were busy failing at every startup you tried, and Dad was playing patriarch, I was securing my place here." I leaned forward. "I was preparing for this." I turned back to my father. "Remember when you needed extra capital in 2017 for expansion? You signed over 15% of your shares to me in exchange for my investment, and in 2019, when we had that legal issue, another 10% was transferred to my name as collateral, which you never bothered to reclaim. That, along with my original 35%, makes me the majority shareholder." My father's jaw clenched. But Ethan was beginning to panic. "You have to be," he began, but I cut him off. I pulled out another document. "This is the most recent state filing. Want to verify?" Ethan grabbed the paper, scanning it quickly, his face drained of color with every passing second. You can't do this," he stammered. "Dad, tell her she can't do this." My father didn't speak because he knew I had outmaneuvered him legally, and there was nothing he could do to reverse it. I exhaled slowly and stood up. "I'm not firing you, Ethan," I said. "I wouldn't want to push you into the real job market, but you'll report to me, and you'll work under my leadership. Otherwise," I gestured to the door, "you're free to leave." Ethan turned to my father, his eyes full of desperation, but for the first time in his life, my father had no response, no way to fix this, because this wasn't his company anymore, it was mine. The silence in the room felt heavy. Ethan still gripped the legal document in his hands, his knuckles white from the pressure. My father stood rigid beside him, his face unreadable, but I could tell he was calculating, trying to find a way out. There wasn't one. I had spent years preparing for this moment, not because I expected betrayal, but because experience had taught me never to trust that loyalty would outweigh power. For the first time, my father looked at me as though he didn't recognize me. Maybe he never truly had. "So, this is it?" Ethan finally spoke, his voice thick with resentment. "You're just taking everything?" I let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Taking everything?" I repeated, stepping closer to him. "Ethan, I built this company from nothing, every contract, every expansion, every innovation. I made it happen, while you were busy failing upwards. I kept this company afloat. So, no, I'm not taking anything," I said, leaning in slightly. "I'm just keeping what's already mine." Ethan's face twisted in anger, but he had no rebuttal. He knew I was right, and worse, so did my father. He had spent years believing that bloodline mattered more than ability, that his son would inherit what was mine by right. He had underestimated me, and now he was paying the price. Finally, my father broke the silence. "You're making a mistake, Lisa," he said, his voice calm but cold. But I could hear the strain in his voice. "A family should stay united. Do you really want to burn this bridge?" I locked eyes with him. "Dad," I said, my tone slow and deliberate, "you burned that bridge the moment you made your decision without me." His lips pressed together in a thin line. "Business is about more than just one person. We can find a solution that works for everyone." I tilted my head slightly, pretending to think it over. "Oh, I agree. That's why I'm offering both of you a choice." I turned to Ethan first. "You can stay on with the company," I said, keeping my voice calm and professional, "but you won't be CEO. You'll take on an advisory role with limited authority. Your salary will still be generous, but you'll report to me." Ethan stiffened, but I didn't hesitate. "Or, you can walk away. I'll buy out your shares at market value. You can take the money and find something new to focus on." My father scoffed. "You're acting like you have all the leverage." I smiled. "I do." The room went silent. I let the weight of my words hang there, letting them feel the sting of helplessness. After what felt like an eternity, my father exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if in disbelief. "I never thought you'd do this," he muttered, almost to himself. "Not to your own family." A sharp pang hit me at his words. Not to your own family. I wanted to remind him that it was he who had pushed me out, treated me as if I were dispensable, but I didn't. It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that I wasn't going to let them take what I had built, not now, not ever. Ethan stormed out first. Good riddance. I knew my brother well enough to predict his next move. He'd go to the relatives and family friends, playing the role of the victim, claiming corporate betrayal, but I didn't care. I wasn't here for their approval. I was here to secure my future. My father hesitated for a moment, waiting for me to back down. When I didn't, he nodded slowly. "You've changed," he said quietly. I met his gaze. "No, Dad, I just stopped pretending." And then he left. I sank back into my chair, exhaling deeply. I should have felt triumphant. I had fought for my place and won. But as I stared at the empty doorway, a different feeling lingered, something quieter, something more painful. A part of me had always craved my father's approval. I'd hoped that, if I worked hard enough, if I proved myself time and again, he would finally see me. But the truth was, he never had. And now, he had no choice but to see me for who I really was, not his daughter, not his temporary substitute, the true leader of Harper & Company. Turning my attention back to the screen, my focus sharpened. I'd spent 12 years building this company. Now, I'd spend the next 12 making it untouchable. My father and brother had tried to take everything from me, but in the end, they had lost everything. For the first time in 12 years, my office felt empty. No calls from my father, no passive-aggressive emails from Ethan, just silence. But silence didn't mean peace. It meant the battle had only just begun. I knew my father wouldn't walk away quietly, and Ethan, he would fight tooth and nail to reclaim what he believed was his birthright. I wasn't naive enough to think this was over. It had only just begun. By the following morning, I could feel the shift in the company. Employees who had been confident and supportive just days ago now seemed wary, hesitant to take a side. A few department heads avoided my gaze. I knew exactly what was happening. My father and Ethan were working their networks, family friends, board members, senior executives, whispering behind closed doors. They were trying to plant seeds of doubt, portraying me as cold, ruthless, and disloyal. Ethan, especially, was playing the role of the betrayed son, wronged by his own sister. I could picture him now, sitting at a posh restaurant, feigning sorrow as he told our investors how I had stolen the company from under him. And my father? He wouldn't need to say much. A heavy sigh, a slight shake of his head, And the carefully chosen words, "I only ever wanted what was best for my children." It was a dangerous game they were playing. If they could sway my board members and top executives, they could push me out of my own company, or at the very least, make my leadership untenable. But I wasn't going to let that happen. That afternoon, I called an emergency executive meeting. As I walked into the boardroom, I could feel the tension in the air. Half the room avoided my eyes, while the other half watched me closely, waiting for me to falter. I took my seat at the head of the table. "Let's not waste any time," I said, my voice steady. "I know there have been talks behind closed doors, conversations over drinks, whispered words." I let my gaze sweep across the room, stopping just long enough to make everyone squirm. "I also know that some of you are questioning whether my leadership is sustainable." A few of them stiffened. No one spoke. I tapped my fingers on the table, breaking the silence. "Let's put those doubts to rest." I brought up a presentation on the screen behind me: numbers, data, facts. I built this company from a small regional business to a $75 million industry leader. Under my leadership, we've seen a 300% increase in revenue over the past 5 years and expanded into 6 new markets. As I looked over at Paul, the CFO, I asked, "Is there any financial data showing that the company is struggling under my leadership?" Paul hesitated briefly before shaking his head. "No, the numbers are solid. In fact, projections indicate a 20% growth next quarter." I nodded in understanding. "So let's be clear about what's really happening here." I leaned forward. "My father and brother aren't upset because the company is faltering. They're upset because they expected me to step aside and let Ethan take over, regardless of his qualifications or the results." The atmosphere in the room grew tense. Then, I dropped the real bombshell. "I also know that some of you have been approached in the past day and offered incentives to support my resignation." I gave the room a sharp look. "If anyone here would like to come forward and admit to those conversations, now's your chance." A few of the executives shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable. After a long silence, one senior executive cleared his throat. "I got a call," he confessed, "from your father. He mentioned possibly making an official appeal to the board." I nodded, unsurprised. "Did he offer anything in exchange for your support?" There was a brief pause before he nodded slowly. "Yes." I let out a long exhale. "My father built this company," I said. "I won't deny that. But I've taken it further than he ever could, and I won't let him manipulate it from the outside." My voice dropped a notch, calm but threatening. "If he wants a fight, he'll get one." I gathered my papers, locking eyes with each executive around the table. "If anyone here thinks my father and brother should be in control, now is the time to make that known." The room remained silent. No one moved. "Good," I said, standing up and walking out, head held high. This wasn't just about holding on to my company, it was about ensuring they never thought they could take it from me again. That evening, I made a call, not to a board member, not to an investor, but to a journalist. By the morning, every major news outlet carried the same headline: "Power shift at Harper & Co. Lisa Harper outmaneuvers family in boardroom battle." The move was made. Now, I was waiting for their response. The morning after the story broke, my inbox flooded: emails, calls, messages from journalists, investors, and board members. Some offered support, others were cautious, but all asked the same question: is it true? I let them wait. I knew exactly what my father was trying to do. For decades, he'd perfected the art of controlling public perception. He knew the power reputation held in business. If he couldn't beat me in the boardroom, he'd try to do it in the media. By noon, the first counterstrike arrived, a press release, polished and carefully worded, but laced with deceit. "Harper & Company has always been a family business. We are deeply saddened by recent events but remain committed to the values that made this company great. Leadership changes are part of business, and we hope to transition smoothly." It was subtle, but I knew its message: Lisa is reckless. Lisa is unstable. Lisa can't be trusted. I wasn't shocked. I was pissed. I sat in my office, watching news analysts debate my leadership. Did Lisa Harper push too aggressively to take over? Will her lack of cooperation hurt the company in the long run? They spoke as if I wasn't watching, as if they didn't realize I was already planning my next move. If my father and Ethan wanted a public war, they were going to get one. Instead of issuing a statement or holding a press conference, I called an old friend in investigative journalism. "I have something for you," I said, "but you'll need to move quickly." An hour later, I sent over documents, emails, financial reports, internal memos, proof that Harper & Company, under my father's leadership, had been involved in questionable financial practices over the years, issues I'd spent the last decade quietly addressing. The story broke within 24 hours, behind the scenes at Harper & Company, a legacy of hidden debts and financial cover UPS. The article was scathing, praising my leadership in turning the company around, criticizing my father's financial mismanagement, and, most importantly, proving that I was the reason Harper & Company had survived. The narrative shifted instantly. The board stopped questioning me, investors stopped hesitating, and my father, he had nowhere left to hide. 2 days later, my father called. I let the phone ring 3 times before picking up. "Lisa," he said, his voice tight, "we need to talk." I leaned back in my chair. "Do we?" There was silence, followed by a sigh. "You didn't have to do that." I chuckled softly. "Neither did you. This company was meant to be a legacy," he said, "for the family, for both of you." A small, foolish part of me had once wanted that, too, but not anymore. "Dad," I said quietly, "if you wanted me to protect the legacy, you should have trusted me with it. Instead, you tried to take it from me." Another long pause. Then, almost reluctantly, he asked, "What happens now?" I exhaled slowly. Now I made sure they'll never touch my company again. The war was over, my father had lost, Ethan had vanished, and I had won. But as I sat in my office, gazing out at the city skyline, I felt no sense of victory, no triumph, just emptiness. I had spent 12 years building Harper & Company, protecting it, strengthening it, and yet, the cost of that victory weighed heavier than I had imagined, because while I had secured my position, I had lost something far more valuable, my family. The following morning, I entered the office with the same composure as always, but everyone knew what had really happened. The whispers had died down, the uncertainty faded. I was no longer just Lisa Harper, the CEO. I was the woman who had outsmarted her father and brother and come out on top. Some admired me for it, some feared me for it, and some were still waiting for me to slip up. I let them wait. At noon, my father and I sat down for what would be our final conversation. He looked weary, older, as if the reality of what had unfolded had finally taken its toll. I didn't say anything, waiting for him to speak first. When he finally did, his voice was softer than I had ever heard it. "I'm stepping down," he said, his tone final, effective immediately. I didn't react. I had been expecting this. "I'll sell my remaining shares," he continued. "I'll hold on to a small stake as an investor, but I won't be involved from here on out." I studied him carefully. "And Ethan?" His jaw tightened at the mention of his name. "He's gone," he confessed. "Took the buyout. He won't be coming back." I had known it would end like this. Ethan had never been capable of facing his own failures. Once it became clear that he had lost, he did what he always did, ran. But hearing it out loud made something inside me stir, not regret, not guilt, just the finality of it all. I nodded, keeping my voice steady. "Understood." He sighed, rubbing his temple as if battling a headache. After a long pause, he said something I hadn't expected. "I underestimated you." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest I'd ever get, and strangely, I realized I didn't need it anymore. A month later, Harper & Company was a completely different place. The old board members who had aligned with my father and brother were gone. The executives who had doubted me were replaced. The company had always thrived under my leadership, but now it was truly mine, and with that ownership, I set a new course. I introduced initiatives my father had always rejected, modernized systems he had considered unnecessary, and expanded into industries he had been too cautious to approach. In just 6 months, profits surged. A year later, we crossed the $100 million mark. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just fighting to prove myself. I was building something no one could ever take from me again. A year after the dust had settled, I met my father for dinner. It was the first time we had spoken since his retirement. He seemed different, softer. There was no anger in his eyes anymore, just a kind of quiet acceptance. "I read about the latest deal you closed," he remarked over his drink. "That was a smart move." I smirked slightly. "I know." A faint smile tugged at his lips. The tension between us had evaporated. There was no longer a battle to fight, just the undeniable truth that he had tried to push me aside, and I had proved him wrong. He raised his glass toward Harper & Company. "This time," I said as I clinked my glass against his, "I don't feel anger or resentment, just peace, because I had already won, and I no longer needed his approval to know it." Now, as I sit in my office, gazing out at the city where I built my empire, I reflect on the lessons this journey has taught me. Family can be your greatest adversary. Loyalty is a currency, not a given. Power is never granted, it's seized. But most of all, the greatest way to prove your worth is to stop seeking validation and build something so unshakable that no one can ever disregard you again. I have no regrets. Harper & Company is mine, and I'll make sure no one ever forgets it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Stay stunned.